when we think about the influence of the environment on decisions, we can think that perhaps the environment will be like waves, that it will get people to decide one thing one way, another thing another way, and so on, and things would move and switch and so on. Or we can think to ourselves that maybe what would happen is that once we make a certain decision, that decision will stick with us and would disproportionately influence our future decisions. Now I want us to think about what is the role of our first decision in a category on our future decisions in that category. So I want you to think about the following case. How should people decide about buying coffee? What is the rational model that tells us how we should decide if to buy coffee or not? And the rational model is very simple. You have a valuation, how much you think you would get from this coffee, what kind of pleasure you expect to get from this coffee. And if the pleasure is high, you would pay more. If it's low, you would pay less. And for each amount of pleasure, you have an associated amount of money. So you say, how much pleasure do I expect to get from this cup of coffee? You say, $2.40. If they charge me more, I will not pay. If they charge me less, I would pay. This is the standard rational model of saying how much are we willing to pay for coffee. Now that's a model that says that we actually know how to evaluate coffee. Instead, I want to propose something we call self-herding model. And the self-herding model is a model that says that we're influenced by our past decisions as we make future decisions. So first of all, let's think about what's herding. Herding is the idea that we follow other people. For example, imagine that you walk down the street and you see two empty restaurants. You don't know which one to choose, you don't know anything about them, you pick one. Somebody else comes after you. They also know nothing, but they see one restaurant with one person and one restaurant with zero. What do? They follow the herd. They go to the restaurant with one person. Somebody else comes. They see a restaurant with two. They follow that. Another person comes. They see three. And so on. Eventually, one restaurant is a big hit. One is a complete failure with no information, just because people tend to follow other people. Or here's another example. Sometimes there are fires in clubs and other places that have lots of people. And what happened in all of those cases, almost all of them, is that there's sometimes exits where people just run over each other and kill each other as they try to escape, and other exits that nobody tried to escape. And you can think to yourself, what will happen? Imagine that you're in a big room with lots of people, and all of a sudden there are fire alarms and everybody is running in a certain direction. Are you going to stop? Are you going to say, hey, let me stop and let me see what people are doing? Maybe there's something that everybody else is missing. Or are you going to be inclined to try to run after them and follow the herd? Most likely you're going to try and follow the herd. The instinct is just incredibly strong. So what is self-herding? Self-herding is like herding, but it's herding that we follow ourselves. You make one decision and you remember what decision you make, and therefore you're likely to follow it and follow it and follow it. And let me kind of explain to you how this might look like in coffee. So imagine that it is 14 years ago or 15 years ago, and you live in Boston, and every day you get up in the morning and you go to the office, and on the way you stop at Dunkin' Donuts, which is a simple coffee shop, and you buy a cup of coffee for 40 cents, and you go to the office and you're very happy. And you're used to that. And one day it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're thirsty, you're tired, you need coffee, and you also need to run some errand. You're going to run some errand, you really feel like coffee, and you see this new coffee place. Let's say it's Starbucks. And you've never seen Starbucks before, and you know nothing about them, but you're really thirsty, and you're tired, and you're a little aggravated, and you walk into Starbucks. And you can't believe how much coffee costs. You've been paying 40 cents up to now, and you can't imagine that coffee could cost all of a sudden $2.50 and $3.50. But you know what? You're there already. You're really dying for coffee, and you don't feel like walking 4 more blocks, so you're buying coffee there. You go out, you go for your errands. 3 days later, you pass by the same corner again. What do you remember about your past decisions? Do you remember why you did it? Do you remember your emotional states? Do you remember how much in a hurry you were, how much of a need of caffeine you need, how aggravated you were? Of course not. 3 days ago at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, how did you feel? Do any of you remember? Of course not. We have very bad memory for our emotional states, but we do remember our actions. So in the same way, you say to yourself, I don't remember why, but I remember that the past me from 3 days ago stood here and made this decision to go into Starbucks. Therefore, it must be a fantastic decision. I always make fantastic decisions. Let me do it again. And then you do it again and again and again and again. And after a while, you stop thinking about whether this was the right decision or not. You assume, in the same way that when you have a long line of people, you assume that they know something. When you have a long line of you making the same decisions in the past, you assume that this was the right decision. Now, here's an experiment to get us to think about this, about how the role of the first decision influenced later decisions. So I've done this many times. I come to a big group of people and I say, here are some products, for example, a trackball, a keyboard, a cheap wine, an expensive wine, design book, and some Belgian chocolates. In the experiments, we don't tell people how much the wine costs. We just describe the wine from Wine Spectre and Wine Magazine and so on. And we pass the products around so everybody can look at them and examine them and so on. And then we say, okay, now that you know all the products, here's a list. Here's a piece of paper with all the products. And at the top, we ask you to put the last 2 digits of your social security number, of your national ID number. And everybody puts the number. In my case, it will be 79. People write these numbers, and then we say, please take that number and make it into a dollar amount. So in my case, it will be $79, and write that amount in dollars next to each of those items. So people have numbers that end up in high numbers, we write high numbers. People that have numbers that end up in low numbers, would write low numbers. And then we say, hypothetically, would you pay this amount in dollars for each of those products? And people say yes or no, hypothetically. And then we say, and now, please submit a real bid. We're going to have an auction. We'll find the highest bidders. They'll pay. They'll get the product. It's for real, but submit your real bids. People submit the real bids. We find out who is the highest bidder. They pay. We give them the products. And we also ask people, we say, do you think that your social security number, this random 2 digits, had any influence? And people say, of course not. But when we look at the results, we find that they had a real big influence. And here's kind of an example from one experiment. When we look at people who had social security numbers below 50, these are the average prices they paid. When we look at people that have ending numbers above 50, these are the numbers they had, and this is the difference in percentages. You see, it's quite amazing. Now, do people who give you social security numbers know that you're going to be willing to spend a lot of money or spend very little money? Of course not. What happens is that the moment we get people to consider a number, that number stays in their mind. It doesn't have to be a social security number. It could be the weather, it could be shoes, it could be whatever. In fact, the more random it is, the better it is for the experiment. But the moment you consider a number, that number stays with you. So for example, you might say to yourself, $79 for a bottle of wine. No, that's too expensive, but maybe I'll pay 50. And somebody that started with the number 12, maybe said 12 for a bottle of wine. Yes, I will do it for sure. How much more would I pay? Well, maybe I'll pay 21. So basically, people start with their starting point, even if it's random, and stay too close to that. Now, I should say that there was another interesting pattern of the data. Even though we could take each product and move it up and move it down kind of arbitrarily based on social security number, the relationship between them were quite good. So for example, everybody was willing to pay more for the expensive wine than the cheap wine. We couldn't switch that. Everybody was willing to pay more for the keyboard than the trackball. Once you pick a specific product, other products in the same category follow a particular trend and remains in a relative good position, but you can switch everything up and down quite easily. And this is all about the role of the first decision. It suggests that once we make a first decision, we remember that decision, and that decision becomes, we call it an anchor, a starting point for our future decisions. This, of course, brings to mind the famous story from Tom Sawyer and Mark Twain. And if you remember the story is that Tom Sawyer escaped from school and went to the river, and Aunt Polly caught him. And Aunt Polly banished him to whitewash the fence. And here it is, it's Sunday, and Tom Sawyer is whitewashing the fence. And his friend Billy the Steam is coming down from the hill, and he's saying, poor Tom Sawyer, you have to spend Sunday whitewashing the fence, and I am going to go to the river. And Tom Sawyer doesn't move. He continues to whitewash the fence. And then Billy the Steam continues to make fun of him, and Tom Sawyer turns around to him and says, what do you mean, poor Tom Sawyer? It's not every day that a kid gets to paint a fence. And Billy the Steam said, oh, you know, that's kind of interesting. Can I try? And Tom Sawyer said, well, not so fast. Aunt Polly is particular about who she lets and who she doesn't let paint the fence. It's kind of a special privilege. Not everybody can do it. And then Billy the Steam says, what if I give you my apple? And Tom Sawyer says, yeah, for that seems like a good deal. And he let him whitewash the fence for an apple, and more friends come in, and more of them are giving Tom great treasures and all kinds of things. And Tom Sawyer reflects on the day, and he reflects on the fact that life is not that bad after all, and there's all kinds of things that you could do better. But what Tom Sawyer and Mark Twain suggest in this particular story is that it's not only that we can make something better and something worse, we can actually make something from being positive from being negative. Is whitewashing the fence an adventure and something good that you should be willing to pay for it, or is something negative that you should be paid for doing so? Now, there's, of course, all kinds of interesting things in the market. There are, for example, people who go to prison to spend the night, like in a hotel, and they pay a lot of money for it. There are vacations that you go to work, where you go to become a farmer, or you go to squash wine, or pick fruit, or all kinds of things. There's all kinds of things that can become from pleasure to work, and it's not really clear. Now, we tried this version of Tom Sawyer. We tried to see whether there was something that we could move from being pleasurable to displeasurable and the other way around. And we chose to think of my ability to recite poetry. So I came to a group of students, and I recited them a particular piece of poetry from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Whoever you are, holding me now in hand, without one thing, all will be useless. I give you fair warning before you attempt me further. I am not what you suppose, but far different. Who is he that would become my follower? Who would sign himself as a candidate for my affection? The way is suspicious, the result uncertain, perhaps destructive. You would have to give up all else. I alone would expect to be your sole and exclusive standard. And after reciting a little bit of poetry, I said, you know what, on Friday I'm going to have a poetry recital. And I'm going to have 3 poetry recitals. Short, middle length, and long one. And then I said, look, I don't have space for all of you. This was a very big class. I only have space for a few. So I'm going to have an auction procedure for you to decide who would get into the recital and who would not. And I gave people a sheet of paper to submit their bids. But for some people, I said in the beginning, before you start, tell me hypothetically whether you would be willing to pay $10 to listen to Professor Ariely recite poetry for 5 minutes. And then they said yes or no, and then they said how much they would pay for the short, medium, and long recital. To other people, it was the same thing, but we said, hypothetically, before we start, tell me whether you would be willing to listen to Professor Ariely recite poetry for 5 minutes if we paid you $10. What happened? The people who we asked them about willing to pay, paying $10, were willing to pay. The people we asked them about we paying them wanted to listen only if we paid them. So what happened is that people don't know if me reciting poetry is good or bad, and we can change their understanding based on the first question. And what about longer poetry reading? They just went in the same direction. So if somebody thought about it in the negative direction, that they should be paid, then they thought they should be paid for longer poetry reading more. And if somebody thought it was positive, they're willing to pay more for longer poetry readings. So the fact is that people don't know, for example here, if this is good or bad, but once they decide, everything becomes coherent, everything becomes sensible within that range. Now let's go back to Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts. Because if you think about first decision influence later decisions, you could ask, how come Dunkin' Donuts did not influence Starbucks' decisions? If we have decisions about coffee, why isn't my first decision about coffee at 40 cents influencing my later willing to pay for coffee at Starbucks? And the point here is that Starbucks did lots of things to get us not to think about Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts as decisions in the same category. Think about it. When you go to a restaurant and you look at the menu, do you compare things across categories? For example, have you ever looked at the wine menu and said, my goodness, for the difference in price between these two bottles of wine, I can get 4 gallons of milk? Of course you don't. You don't think about other categories. We compare appetizers to appetizers and main dishes to main dish, dessert to desserts, wine to wine, beer to beer. We don't compare even within the menu. And what Starbucks wanted to ensure is that we don't compare Starbucks coffee to Dunkin' Donuts coffee. And how do they do it? By all kinds of superficial but important things. First of all, they did not start by selling donuts and cookies and muffins. Imagine the following case. Imagine that Starbucks started and they created stores that were just like Dunkin' Donuts. The same design, they sold everything, only the coffee was better quality. How much more would you be willing to pay for coffee under those conditions? If you could contrast them directly and compare them, I'm betting that you would not be willing to pay much more for that coffee. But they basically wanted to separate the decision as if it's wine and milk. So they told us about single bean coffee. And they told us about, they sold us French presses. And there were no donuts, and there were no donuts hall, and there were no muffin, there were only French and Italian pastries. And you couldn't ask for a small coffee. If you asked for a small coffee, they would say, excuse me, I have no idea what you're talking about. We have all these other things, mochaccino, frappuccino, da 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 da. And we only have macchiatos and croissants and biscotti and so on. And because of that, because of all of these superficial things, we did not compare the two directly, and we were willing to treat Starbucks as a new category of decision and accept whatever price they were offering to us. Now, many years later, the decision to spend more money on coffee and the decision to go into Starbucks is already automatic. Now we don't need to think about it. It's something we just do without thinking, and because of that, now Starbucks can change. Starbucks can start selling us muffins and cookies and even donuts. Something they couldn't have done in the beginning because of the separation, they can now do because we don't think about the decision so much. This, by the way, also resonates very well with what Konrad Lorenz showed many years ago. Konrad Lorenz was an amazing researcher, and he showed that if ducklings hatch, what they do is they look at the first figure in front of them and start following it. And in fact, for many of them, Konrad Lorenz was that figure. He was just waiting for the ducklings to hatch. They observed him, and then they kept on following him. And it's a really good analogy for how we think about the first decision. It's imprinted on us, and then we're just making the same decision over and over without thinking very much about it. There's couples of ways to think about how this idea of initial pricing influencing later pricing and influence us in the recent activities in the world. So think, for example, about the first iPhone. When the first iPhone was introduced in the US, it was introduced at $600. And very quickly, Apple said, sorry, it's only $400. Was this a good pricing strategy or a bad pricing strategy? When I talked to the people at Apple, they said, of course, it was a brilliant strategy. But let's think to ourselves about what do we think about this. So imagine two universes. In one of them, the first iPhone is introduced at $400. In the other one, it introduces $600. And then very, very quickly, they said, no, sorry, it's only $400. In which of those two universes would you be more likely to buy the iPhone at $400? Here's the thing. As a consumer, you have this new device. And you have to figure out how much it's worth. Is it $20? Is it $200? Is it $600? How much is it worth to you? Very hard to figure out. So now think about it. What happens in these two universes? If it's $400, you have to really figure out how much it's worth to you. But if it went down from $600 to $400, now all of a sudden you could do a relative comparison. And even though the $600 is no longer available, as long as it's available in your memory, the contrast is still there. And now you say to yourself, it's two-thirds of the price. Clearly a good deal. Now creating a much better version. It looks much more appealing. So when you do relative prices could be to things that are existing in the market, but they could also be to phantom products, things that used to exist in the market or exist only in your memory. Now later on in the US, Apple decreased the price of the iPhone even further and rolled that extra price into the monthly fee to the cell phone companies. And then what happened? Then they introduced the big iPhone, the iPad. Now what happens? You have the same device without the phone and only bigger. You have the same screen, only bigger. How much can you charge for it? Well, how much you can charge for the iPad has very little to do with the actual value that it's giving and a lot to do with the relative size and the relative price. Whatever you price the iPhone, the iPad kind of tracks, not exactly per square inch, but it tracks in a relative similar ways. And you know what? All the other tablets have to follow the iPad pricing as well. We are relative comparative creatures. We're looking at price in relative way. It's very hard for any product to come out outside of this comparison. The same thing, by the way, can be said about the internet more generally. When the internet started, we call this internet 0.0, there was a logic, and the logic was, let's give everything for free. And if we give everything for free, people would come and come and come and come in masses. And that was true. And then they said, and once people come in masses and use our services, they will get used to it. And we want to use it, and they'll be willing to pay $19.95 for that. That was not so true. Because when we experience something, we might value it, but not necessarily be willing to pay for it. And because of that, by the way, we moved to this internet as being an advertising platform rather than a platform that people pay for it. And the point here, the point I want you to think about is that once we make initial decisions, other decisions follow. The way we train people to think initially is most likely going to be the way that they're going to make decisions later on. It also suggests that when we introduce a new product, we have a tremendous latitude in how we want people to think about it and how we can price it. But once we've introduced it and people got used to thinking about it in a certain way, it's really hard to escape that comparison point.